Now that we've gone over some Voronoi fracture setups, I'd like to briefly talk about when you might want to use those in production. Now, we've just done a wood splinter fracture, and as I mentioned, this would be a good case for where you would want to use Voronoi fractures instead of Booleans. And for more art-directed, interesting shapes like you would expect out of concrete, I do go to Boolean fractures for those sort of things pretty much 100% of the time. But a couple other examples of where you might want to use them are to create proxy shell cages for deformable effects. In this particular case, I've just used this Tommy test geometry that comes bundled with Houdini, and I've done a quick Voronoi fracture on that mesh to create this little cage on him. Let me explode that out. We just have lots of pieces covering the entire surface of the character. Now in this case, I built a nice clean unified mesh out of this by converting him to a VDB with this VDB from Polygon's node. I've reshaped that a little bit, just dilated that with the VDB reshape node. It's kind of an optional step, and then converted that to polygons. You can see the difference with and without that reshape here. And then we just do a normal Voronoi fracture on this. But in this case, I've turned off this create interior surfaces option, so it just creates all these planar bits without all those 3D inside pieces. And then I've done a poly extrude on those to give them each a bit of thickness. On the poly extrude, we just make the distance negative so that it goes inwards, and I've turned on this output back, which I really think should be on by default, but it's not. And the other thing to watch out for is this extrusion mode. In this particular case, it kind of works okay when you use the default primitive / edge normal, but in many cases that can do some weird things, particularly in more detailed sections of the geometry. So often you'll get a better result out of this point normal option. So then I'll pack this geometry up. We'll talk more about packed geometry later. And I'm just doing kind of a silly bend on those packed pieces. Packed pieces are completely rigid and not able to bend. And then we're using all of these individual pieces to deform that Tommy character in a kind of weird way. Now, I don't want to get too ahead of things by getting into packed geometry and deformable sims, but I've used this technique a lot to, for example, smash cars. I'll often create a shell of pieces around a car like this, and then run a rigid body sim on that, which I will then use to deform the high-res car. So in cases like these, it's really not worth doing a detailed Boolean fracture when you really just need this rough representation to drive the final shape of your geometry. You can also use the same principle in reverse, where perhaps if you have a deforming character like this animated in your shot, and you need some proxy pieces to use as colliders, as you'll find out later, it's not really good to just use the character as one mesh as a collision object for a rigid body simulation. So I will often take something like a deforming character and break that into lots of pieces at a rest frame, and then I will point deform those fractured pieces with the actual character animation to get a decent collider object. There are other techniques to do that sort of thing besides a Voronoi fracture. We'll discuss convex decomposition later, but just wanted to mention that as another quick use case for a reasonable Voronoi fracture in production. Now another case where I'd use Voronoi fractures is for parts of your asset that don't need to be super highly detailed. Now we're going to use this later for the window frames on our building that we'll be destroying, because these window frames don't really need super detailed inside faces. You don't really need curvy cuts through it because the geometry is so skinny that you don't really notice the difference between pretty simplistic cuts versus doing something much more detailed on those edges there. It's really not worth it to set up booleans for some pieces like this. You absolutely can use booleans if you'd like, but yeah, often for those more simple fracture cases, I'll just do a quick Voronoi instead.